history of Apple. The story of Steve Jobs and the company he founded. Our huge, comprehensive rundown of Apple's history will take you from its origins in the 1970s, Jobs' departure and later return to Apple. Follow the Apple story with us. The foundation of Apple, a history of everyone's favorite startup, is a tech fairy tale of one garage, three friends and very humble beginnings. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The two Steves, Jobs and Wozniak, may have been Apple's most visible founders. But were it not for their friend Ronald Wayne, there might be no iPhone, iPad or iMac today. Jobs convinced him to take 10% of the company stock and act as an arbiter should he and Woz come to blows. But Wayne backed out 12 days later, selling for just $500 a holding that would have been worth $72 billion 40 years later. How Jobs met Woz. Jobs and Woz, that's Steve Wozniak, were introduced in 1971 by a mutual friend, Bill Fernandez, who went on to become one of Apple's earliest employees. The two Steves got along thanks to their shared love of technology and pranks. Jobs and Wozniak joined forces, initially coming up with pranks such as rigging up a painting of a hand showing the middle finger to be displayed during a graduation ceremony at Jobs' school, and a call to the Vatican that nearly got him access to the Pope. Why Apple was named Apple. The name Apple was to cause Apple problems in later years as it was uncomfortably similar to that of the Beatles' publisher, Apple Corp., but its genesis was innocent enough. Speaking to Byte magazine in December 1984, Woz credited Jobs with the idea. He was working from time to time in the orchards up in Oregon. I thought that it might be because there were apples in the orchard, or maybe just its fruitarian nature. Maybe the word just happened to occur to him. In any case, we both tried to come up with better names, but neither one of us could think of anything better. After Apple was mentioned, according to the biography of Steve Jobs, the name was conceived by Jobs after he returned from Apple Farm. He apparently thought the name sounded fun, spirited and not intimidating. Later the company settled on the byte out of an apple design for Apple's logo, a far simpler logo design. These logos are probably the reason for other theories about the meaning behind the name Apple, with some suggesting that the Apple logo with a chunk taken out of it is a nod at computer scientist and Enigma codebreaker Alan Turing, who committed suicide by eating a cyanide-infused apple. However, according to Rob Janoff, the designer who created the logo, the Turing connection is simply a wonderful urban legend. Equally, the bite taken out of the apple could represent the story of Adam and Eve from the Old Testament. The idea being that the apple represents knowledge. An original Apple I, in a case, Jobs was banking on producing enough working computers within that time to settle the bill out of the proceeds from selling completed units to Byte Shop. The risk involved was too great for Ronald Wayne, and it's ultimately this that saw him duck out. Jobs and Woz didn't have two nickels to rub together, Wayne told Next Shark in 2013. If this thing blew up, how was that going to be repaid? Did they have the money? No. Was I reachable? Yes. Family and friends were roped in to sit at a kitchen table and help solder the parts. And once they'd been tested, Jobs drove them over to Byte Shop. When he unpacked them, Terrell, who had ordered finished computers, was surprised by what he found. As Michael Moritz explains in Return to the Little Kingdom, Some energetic intervention was required before the boards could be made to do anything. Tyrrell couldn't even test the board without buying 2 transformers. Since the Apple I didn't have a keyboard or a television, no data could be funneled in or out of the computer. Once a keyboard had been hooked to the machine, it still couldn't be programmed without somebody laboriously typing in the code for BASIC, since Wozniak and Jobs hadn't provided the language on the cassette tape or in a ROM chip. Finally, the computer was naked. It had no case. Dan Bricklin was a student at Harvard Business School when he visualized a heads-up display, like in a fighter plane, where I could see the virtual image of a table of numbers hanging in the air in front of me. I could just move my mouse, keyboard, calculator around on the table, punch in a few numbers, circle them to get a sum, do some calculations, of course. We'd recognize that as a spreadsheet today, but back in the late 1970s, such things existed only on paper. Converting him for digital use would be no small feat. But Bricklin was unperturbed. He borrowed an Apple II from his eventual publisher and set to work, knocking out an Alpha edition over the course of a weekend. Many of the concepts he used are still familiar today, in particular letters above each column and numbers by the rows to use as references when building formulae. Wondering how it compares to numbers today? Here's our numbers review. The technological limitations inherent in the hardware meant that it didn't quite work as Bricklin had first imagined. The Apple II didn't have an incorporated display, and although the mouse had been invented, it wasn't bundled with the machine. So, the display became the regular screen, and the mouse was swapped out for the Apple II's game paddle, which Bricklin described as being a dial you could turn to move game objects back and forth. You could move the cursor left or right, and then push the fire button. And then turning the paddle would move the cursor up and down. It was far from perfect and working this way was sluggish. So Bricklin reverted to using the left and right arrow keys, with the space bar in place of the fire button for switching between horizontal and vertical movement. VisiCalc was unveiled in 1979 and described as a magic sheet of paper that can perform calculations and recalculations. We owe it a debt of gratitude for the part it played in driving sales of the Apple II and anchoring Apple within the industry. Writing in Morgan Stanley's electronics letter shortly before its launch, analyst Benjamin M. Rosen expounded his belief that VisiCalc was so powerful, convenient, universal, simple to use and reasonably priced that it could well become one of the largest selling personal computer programs ever. It could someday become the software tail that wags and sells the personal computer dog. Apple II success. Color graphics through a piece of software worth a little more than $100 was selling a piece of hardware worth 10 times as much. That was uncharted territory. But even with the right software, the Apple II wouldn't have been a success if it hadn't adhered to the company's already established high standards. The February 1984 edition of PC Mag, looking back at the Apple II in the context of what it had taught IBM, put some of its success down to the fact that its packaging did not make it look like a ham radio operator's hobby. A low heat generating switching power supply allowed the computer to be placed in a lightweight plastic case. Its sophisticated packaging differentiated it from computers that had visible boards and wires connecting various components to the motherboard. More radically, though, the Apple II was the first of its type to provide usable UR graphics. Contained expansion slots for which other hardware manufacturers could design devices that could be installed into the computer to perform functions that Apple has never even considered. In short, Apple had designed a computer that embodied what we came to expect of desktop machines through their 1980s, 1990s and the first few years of this century, before Apple turned things on its head again and moved increasingly towards sealed boxes without the option for internal expansion. Almost 6 million Series 2s were produced over 16 years, giving Apple its second big hit. Really, though, the company was still getting started, and its brightest days were still ahead. For VisiCalc, the future wasn't so bright, largely because its developers weren't quick enough to address the exploding PC market. Rival Lotus stepped in and its 1, 2, 3 quickly became the business standard. It bought Software Arts, VisiCalc's developer, in 1985 and remained top dog until Microsoft did to it what Lotus had done to VisiCalc. It usurped it with a rival that established a new digital order. That rival was Excel, which, like VisiCalc, appeared on an Apple machine long before it was ported to the PC. To say this was a bargain would be a massive understatement. Apple has split its stock 4 times since then, in 1987, 2000, 2005 and 2014. Companies do this when the price of a single share starts to get too high, in an effort to stimulate further trading. So, assuming Xerox held on to those shares, it would have had 200,000 by 1987, 400,000 by 2000 and 800,000 by 2005. The split in 2014 was rated at 7-1, so Xerox's holding would leap from 800,000 to 5.6 meters. Selling him at today's prices would rake in $708 million, £450 million. Not bad for a 3-day tour. Jobs was bowled over by the Xerox Alto, a machine used widely throughout the park, with a portrait-to-display and graphical interface, which was way ahead of its time. It had been knocking around for a while by then, but Xerox, which built 2,000 units, hadn't been selling it to the public. It wasn't small, about the size of an under-counter fridge, but it was still considered a personal machine, which was driven home by their user-centric manner in which it was used. It was the first computer to major on mouse use, with a 3-button gadget used to point at and click on objects on the screen. Jobs decreed that every computer Apple produced from the point on should adopt a similar way of working. Speaking to Walter Isaacson some years later, he described the revelation as like a veil being lifted from my eyes. I could see what the future of computing was destined to be. The Apple Lisa had an advanced GUI. Michael Scott was Apple's president and CEO at the time, having been brought to the post by Mark Markula, Apple employee number 3, an investor to the tune of $250,000. The two men worked out a new corporate structure, which sidelined Jobs with immediate effect, and handed control of the Lisa project back to John Couch. Jobs, also stripped of responsibility for research and development within the company, was little more than a figurehead. That left him on the lookout for a new project. Perhaps inevitably, he turned to the Macintosh. Named in honor of Raskin's favorite edible apple, the Macintosh. The Macintosh had been in the works since 1979. So when Jobs joined the team, it was already well advanced. That didn't stop him making extensive changes though, including the commission of a new external design and integration, the graphical operating system. Raskin left the Macintosh team when he and Jobs fell out, and Jobs assumed control for the remainder of its development. However, this enforced switching of sides meant that Jobs, technically, ended up on the losing team. The Lisa launched in 1983, with its graphical user interface in place. The Macintosh debuted the following year. The race had been won by the Lisa. The Macintosh project simpler and smarter through several iterations. The prototype Macintosh became both more able and less complex to build. It had fewer chips, and the Apple engineers were able to push them further and faster. By the time it was ready to launch, the Macintosh incorporated the kind of graphics hardware that would have cost tens of thousands of pounds to buy in any rival machine. Yet Apple was aiming to sell it at a price that would put it in reach of the better-heeled home user. The final spec was radical for its day, with a 6 MHz Motorola 68000 processor ramped up to 7.8 MHz, 128 kilobytes of RAM, and a 9 inches black and white screen with a fixed 512 by 342 pixels. To put that into perspective, it's not even enough to display an app icon from a Retina-class iOS device at its native resolution. But it could still accommodate System Software 1.0, Apple's fully graphical operating system. The Macintosh project. Good looks, but it wasn't just what went on inside the box that made it such an attractive device. The Macintosh looked just good on the outside. Sure, it was shrouded in beige plastic, but the all-in-one body incorporated the floppy drive and a handy carrying handle, so you could easily take it with you wherever you needed to work. It looked friendly, too, and that made it more approachable. There were still some limitations, though. The original Macintosh didn't have a hard drive, so you had to boot from a floppy and could only temporarily eject the system disk when you needed to access applications and data. Apple partially fixed this shortcoming by offering an external add-on drive, which allowed users to keep the system disk in situ and delegate responsibility for apps and data to a second disk. It was an expensive add-on, though, and the external hard disk 20, which cost $1,495 and gave just 20 megabytes of storage, was still a year away from going on sale. Despite its limitations, though, many of the features established on that first Macintosh are still in use today. We've dropped the system moniker in favor of OS, which stands for operating system. But we still use the Finder name, which debuted there. And both Command and Option appeared as modifier buttons on its keyboard. The latter has since been usurped by Alt, at least in the UK, but the name lives on for many users. You'd be surprised by how many people are confused by the fact that Apple still refers to the Option key on the Mac keyboard, even though on UK keyboards that key is known as Alt. Find out more here. What is Option on a Mac? The Macintosh Project Pixels, the hardware was only half of the story. Coder Bill Atkinson had implemented a radical system by which the Macintosh system software allowed for overlapping windows in a more efficient manner than the computers at Park had done. And Susan Kerr spent months developing a visual language in the form of on-screen icons that have since become classics. Susan Care and the command logo she designed. It's Care that we have to thank for the on-screen wrist watch to indicate a background process hogging resources, and the smiling Mac, among others, as well as the seemingly illogical square and circles combination she chose for the command key. This is a common symbol in Sweden, where it's used to denote a national heritage site, not a campsite as has been reported. Her paint, bucket and lasso graphics are used widely in other applications, and the fonts she designed for use on the original Macintosh, which included Chicago, Geneva and Monaco, are still in use today, albeit in finer forms. The Macintosh went on sale in January 1984, priced at $2,495. It wasn't cheap, but it was good value for what you got, and that was reflected in its sales. By the beginning of May that same year, Apple had hit the landmark figure of 70,000 shipped units, which was likely helped in no small part by a remarkable piece of advertising directed by Ridley Scott. Apple's 1984 advert. Nobody would ever deny that the original Macintosh was a work of genius. It was small, relatively inexpensive for its day, and friendly. It brought the GUI, graphical user interface, to a mass audience and gave us all the tools we could ever need for producing graphics-rich work that would have cost many times as much on any other platform. Yet, right from the start, it was in danger of disappointing us. You see, Apple had built it up to be something quite astounding. It was going to change the computing world, we were told, and as launch day approached, the hype continued to grow. It was a gamble, a big one, that any other company would likely have shied away from. Jobs understood what made the Macintosh special, and he knew that. Aside from the keynote address at which he would reveal it, the diminutive machine needed a far from diminutive bit of publicity. He put in a call to Kiat Day, Apple's retained ad agency, and tasked them with filling 60 seconds during the third quarter break of Super Bowl XVIII. Super Bowl ads are always special, but this was in a league of its own. Directed by Blade Runner's Ridley Scott and filmed in Shepperton Studios in the UK. Its production budget stood somewhere between $350,000 and $900,000, depending on who is telling the story. The premise was simple enough, but the message was a gamble, pitting Apple directly against its biggest competitor, IBM. The premise was simple enough, but the message was a gamble, pitting Apple directly against its biggest competitor, IBM. International business machines dominated the workplace of the early 1980s. And the saying that nobody ever got fired for buying IBM was a powerful moniker working in its favor. People trusted the brand, staking their careers on the simple choice of IBM or one of the others. As a result, the others often missed out, and if Apple wasn't going to languish among them, it had to change that perception. So the ad portrayed Apple as humanity's only hope for the future. It dressed Anya Major, an athlete who later appeared in Elton John's Nikita video, in a white singlet and red shorts, with a picture of the Mac on her vest. She was bright, fresh and youthful, and a stark contrast to the cold, blue, shaven-headed drones all about her. They plodded while she ran. They were brainwashed by Big Brother, who lectured them through an enormous screen. But she hurled a hammer through the screen to free them from their penury. Even without the tagline, the inference would have been clear, but Jobs, Apple CEO John Sculley and Kiat Day turned the knife with the memorable slogan. On January the 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.